Designing and constructing buildings takes place over many years, with many people collaborating together. In the Brick and Wonder podcast, we have conversations with people who work together to realize a collective vision. I spoke to two people for this podcast who first met at the American Academy in Rome and whose lifetime of work intersects in the public realm. Walter Hood, a landscape architect based in Oakland, California, who says that design, in its best form, promotes meaning and memory. He says that if you have empathy and love and an interest in a collective future, you can design effectively for everyone.
And I would like for those people who feel that they can't stop thinking in that way. They should feel that they can.
And Mark Robbins, an architect and leading voice in government, academia, and professional institutions, who says that effective design can change the way we live and who we are. He says we need both political and public will to execute important projects, and that design of public space is the highest calling in our profession.
We're not just decorating the ground plane. We're actually doing work that transforms the physical space, and in my case, the installations that I do hopefully transform people's understanding of the society in which they live.
I'm Drew Lang, the founder of Brick and Wonder. This is the Brick and Wonder podcast. Walter, Mark, welcome to the Brick and Wonder podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in New York.
It's good to be here.
So I want to start out our conversation touching on our current political climate. We all want to live in places where there's an openness and an embrace of sound planning and design and investment in the public sphere, an encouragement on the part of the private sector to actively build, right? So you, as someone in your professional life who's been active in this way and who's been quite successful in executing projects in this way, how do we get back to more of that?
In some ways, I think it comes down to education. As architects and designers, we're used to talking to each other and making sense to each other. And it's easy to forget that most people don't engage with buildings or cities or parks as man-made elements, no more than the understanding that everything you see on the film screen is manufactured, right? Somebody had to think about that light switch, that color. It's all produced. Cities are much the same way. They're the result of a series of corporate and individual decisions. And I think we need to be better. This is not to put a hair shirt on designers, but we do need to be better about talking to the public about the benefits of what I call good design or conscientious design. But we also need to develop ways in making sure that our lawmakers, our political representatives, also have an understanding of the fundamental ways in which design can change the way we live and the way we understand who we are. So this was a great thing about the NEA's program, the Mayor's Institute, is that mayors were brought in behind closed doors so the public could see them flailing without them feeling they had to present a kind of front that depicted them as knowing, omniscient, knowing all. And we would ask them to bring in specific problems in their city. Since the city of Cincinnati wanted to get rid of that ring road downtown that disconnected their waterfront with the rest of the city. And it was an eye-opener for the mayor then of Cincinnati to realize that there is a class of professional planners and architects and landscape architects that actually deal with these kinds of issues, with connectivity, making public space, how to diminish the impact of the car, but how to deal realistically with the presence of the car.
See, that's so interesting, right? That the simple awareness of these professionals was realized in that forum. So awareness is a starting place.
Yeah, it's helpful. And it, we have to realize that we're dealing with very specific constraints about doing public projects. They're hugely expensive and they take a very, very long time. So you need political and public will to get these things to happen. And the political will needs to be so detached from a sense of serving one's career, because it's going to take 20 years for a landscape project to come to fruition, or for the West Side Highway to evolve. I mean, the High Line is remarkable for the speed in which it was done, but there was a mayor that was attuned to design, and also there were huge real estate forces behind. So again, there's a profit motive. Now, I believe you can do well by doing good, so I don't see profit as the immediate enemy of the common weal or the public good. One could have a whole separate discussion about the High Line and the results of making this corridor really of very expensive real estate, which does set up a new kind of neighborhood and stresses between the local community and those who are now living in this, what was the former right-of-way of the High Line.
Walter, I want to begin with you by asking about the notion of freedom. What does this spark for you?
God, when I think of freedom, immediately comes to my mind a project that I worked on a few years ago called Freed, F-R-E-E-D. Because again, in the context of the U.S., and I guess my research and my work, freedom, everyone looks at freedom in a different way, and particularly in the American context. How some got here was through this idea of freedom coming from somewhere else and then being welcomed in. Others were freed. Others were never freed. And so I think this context, one definition, is something, again, that has a stronger, more dialectical aspect to it. So it depends on your point of view, where you're coming from, how one looks at it. Collectively, I don't think there's one freedom. Within the context of the U.S., we have all these symbols that suggest freedom, whether it's the Statue of Liberty, a few blocks away, a mile or so away, or a flag. And again, I think these symbols, in order to allow everyone to sort of collectively come together, I think we need better ways to talk about this singular term, freedom.
Hear, hear. What about for you personally? When you, let's say, aspire to a sense of freedom, or maybe you've already achieved a sense of freedom, what does it mean for you personally?
Freedom for me means choice. It's always kind of very early. I saw the more choices I had, the more opportunities I had, which to me freed me from the singular. And very early, I recognized in my community that those who went off into a learned experience, they came back with more opportunities. Even those who went off to the military in my neighborhood came back with more opportunities, choice, versus those who stayed and could only do one thing. They always had to do one thing. And, I think of my grandmother, her generation, one choice, no choices actually. My father, maybe a couple of choices, and then myself, a multitude of choice and opportunities. So that to me is where freedom comes, this ability to have opportunities to, to think something and then act to it. There's a great freedom to that. And not a lot of people have that. And I think that's something that we aspire to in my studio, in the work, is to give people choice and opportunity.
What does that look like? Tell me more about that.
That looks like when I go to a space after I designed it, or a thing, and I see people doing something that I never imagined. That meant that somehow I unpacked something and allowed them to have choice. Because as you know, as an architect, we have programs, right? This has to happen, this has to happen, this has to happen. But the best part of design is where you leave those opportunities for people to find themselves, see something else in the work, and then act on it. And in a way, it liberates them, right, to a certain degree.
I know you initially met Walter Hood at the American Academy in Rome. Among the places that you've traveled with him are communities and work together in opening up dialogue and building trust. Tell me about how you came together with Walter and some of the work that y'all have done together.
Well, Walter's become a very, very good friend. He was the first person that I invited into my studio. Walter is a landscape architect. I was an architect, but doing non-traditional installation art about the histories of site and place. And again, he was the first one I invited in to look at these first tentative sketches that I was doing. And Walter, at that point, had also begun doing watercolors and paintings. So we were both designers, not working in traditional ways. So we had this affinity for each other. But I early on was impressed with the way in which Walter looked at the sites of his operation as very, very complex, that weren't presented as Hallmark card versions of public space where everything is tied up and neat. But he actually looked at the practices that people brought with them into space and thought about how his interventions, how his work could interact with activity on the ground. You know, if you find a place where a lot of guys are washing their cars and their mates are hanging out because they're watching the kids, but they can be with their husband and the children, instead of saying, no, washing cars is not something we do in parks, using it instead as a focus or as an element that you understand and you enhance, bringing more people to this place, bringing greater density, and saying, I've understood something about the way you live day to day, and hopefully my design elevates that and makes it into something which reinforces group activities and the family and all the kinds of things that we respect.
There is this tradition of travel in our industry and other industries too, and an encouragement of it. One thing that I know your fellowship at the American Academy in Rome allowed for is quite a bit of travel, in-depth exploration. When you were there, I understand you met Mark Robbins and began what's now become a long, meaningful relationship. Tell me about that.
Well, the American Academy in Rome, as you alluded to, is an institution that allows for American scholars, artists, musicians, archaeologists, just a diversity of people to come together and spend really up to 6 months to a year engaging in conversation, travel. And for the first time for me was being with a group of people, like-minded people, and going out into the world over and over and over and over again, right? And having experiences together, and then being able to create a culture together where you literally are experiencing and thinking about things and making things collectively, even though you're in your own studio, because you're having some impact on one another. And Mark was probably one of the few people at the Academy that I immediately saw a distinct interest, because he was an artist who had became an administrator who was trying to go back to being an artist. But I knew he was going to stay to be an administrator, but he was still trying to figure out where to go next. And we would sit in the studio for hours just talking about, right, how to do all the things that we want to do. And Mark was probably one of the most extemporaneous, always inspired by something. I had never met anyone. Like one afternoon, he'd come to the studio, so let's go to Barcelona. It's like, what? I want to buy some glasses, some drinking glasses. So we just get on a plane and go to Barcelona. And of course, we then spent 3 days there for this other thing. But it was just like, all of a sudden, it was like, there's just freedom to do things. And that was something that, again, I hadn't been around people who were like that. And very smart, inquisitive. And I had never seen a practice like his. Right? That was the other thing. It was like, well, how do you do this? What defines this? And the other thing I would say, the other piece that I think that was very powerful was our cultural background. Mark as a Jewish man and me as a Black man, there were these affinities that we could talk about in a more personal way that we experience as we came up either through the institutions or the kind of the collective culture, and just recognizing that there was a kind of a connection, between that, which most of the time was unsaid, but it was very clear that there was this empathy, right, that was working back and forth.
Mm-hmm. You feel that.
Yeah.
You feel that and you appreciate that. And it seems like it's grown over time with the two of you.
Oh, early on, Barcelona, which is a great city to look at design in the public realm. I remember being struck by a hospital that was built along the waterfront. And all of the patient rooms faced out over the water, really the most valuable real estate. And I thought in America, we would never see that level of real estate being given over to not-for-profit use. The cafe on the lower level was open for people from the outside as well as for the patients, so that there was a way that you were mixing and not feeling objectified as sick person. And there have also been studies that patients who are facing nature, whether they're looking at green space or water, recover more quickly than those who are facing those sad green painted Celotex walls in hospitals, right? So there was also, a lot of fun in the way that Barcelona approached all of their tourists and also their population. I remember coming out of a dinner, eating fantastic paella, and we exited the restaurant onto the roof of another building, and on that roof was a miniature golf course, and they were serving caipirinhas, and this is 2 a.m. by now, and we're playing miniature golf overlooking the water, having just come from the restaurant, and the place was packed. It was a really vibrant downtown. And we know the Spanish have a very late cycle. I'm not saying that it's the hour that the activity took place in, but the fact that people were so engaged in activities that they could enter without cost. You can walk down the street, you can see people. If you choose to play miniature golf, you can play miniature golf. The best urban spaces are spaces that you can enter into without there being a lot of cost, without there being a sense that you're not meant to be there, right? So it's a good lesson about how we make spaces. I think Walter and I were both attuned to that. Well, we haven't worked together on specific projects, but I know that when I was at the NEA, we were working with curator Mary Jane Jacob, and she had been selected to do a project at Charleston for the Spoleto Festival, to do the visual arts projects. And she was looking for designers of all stripes to work with. And I gave Walter's name among others, and he ended up going down and doing a project. And Walter ended up going to the Art Institute where Mary Jane Jacob taught, and he ended up getting his MFA. So he's a triple threat, with an architecture degree, a landscape architecture degree, and also an MFA, which has allowed his work to be much more changeable over time. And the way he works is not the way a typical designer works. that he has this huge office backup that he maintains and then does client-based work, he'll generally tool up or hire in light of the specific project that he's working on. And this has also allowed him to work on both commercially viable projects and those which are less remunerative for him as a designer. So he's done projects from public monuments to landscapes in the national park system to this wonderful new landscape at the African American Museum in Charleston.
I'm going to switch gears for a moment and ask you about some things you've changed your mind about along the way on your journey.
Well, first, I just start out. It's like in the profession, I think every time I've started out in a singular profession, I immediately changed my mind. I started out in architectural engineering, then immediately after 2 years went to landscape. Stayed in landscape for maybe 4 years, 5 years, and immediately went to architecture. Stayed in architecture for 4 or 5 years, and immediately went back to landscape. Stayed in landscape for a little less than a decade and went to art. Coming out of the art experience, then really finding a kind of a horizontal playing field, right? Which those changes I'm talking about, like this 40 years. Right. So there is this, that's one kind of change. And then on top of that, very early, I thought I wanted to be a designer making those objects, right? Those things. And it became very quickly that I wanted to do more than make an object or a thing. And I don't know, maybe that happened in graduate school when I went back to get my second master's in landscape architecture after I had gone through architectural school. It was very clear that these singular things that I was working on was not making a difference and that I needed to work in a broader way to have impact on the broadest sect of people, right? It's because in architecture, it felt like there was like, let's just say 2,500 people that you're impacting daily. You make a park, God, I impacted 1 million people. Right? Work in a museum. Oh my God, 2 million people came here last year. Right. And so you start saying that, wow, I can have this not only impact, but I can have conversations with a greater sort of attitude of people. And that changed a lot of things because then it was less about making these singular things and it was more about trying to connect these dots across places. And now sometimes I don't even need to make anything to have an impact sometimes. Sometimes it might just be an experience. And I think all of those are valuable, right? And so I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've noticed in the career is the fetishizing of the object, the thing, is not something that I'm interested in the career, but it's the ability to, one, work in a larger kind of collective, whether that's with the public, whether that's with institution, the academy or whatever, but to somehow not have those boundaries.
So there's always more, right? You said you changed your mind about certain things because you wanted more, and it had mostly to do with the work, wanting your work to have impact, wanting for the work to have purpose, but it also sounds like it's just about this striving for more as well.
Well, maybe more is not because that sounds like I'm kind of greedy. I just want to, it's not that I want more. I don't want to consume more. As a Black man in America, I just don't want to be pigeonholed. And this goes back to your first question about freedom, right? I want to have opportunities that I see, not that someone else says that's your opportunity, that's your lane. And I looked at when I first got into this profession, I looked at a lot of my predecessors who looked like me, and they were put in this box. You can only do social housing. You can only, in academia, you're the affirmative action person. We're put in these boxes. And I remember when I got to Cal, UC Berkeley, I went in the library and I looked for authors who looked like me. And there were none. And that was one of my things, was like, okay, by the end of my career, someone's going to come in here and find me. Because I don't want them to have that experience. But I want them to find me, not in that same narrow way. I want them to find me, right? That there then becomes opportunities for themselves and choices, that they don't have to sort of follow a singular thread. Because that's the beauty of our profession. The threads, man, are like, you just pull that hem away, man. It's like all those threads, right? And that's something that I value, but I also want, people behind me to kind of see that as well.
Mark, I've heard you say purpose is something that's really important in your work as a through line to the many things that you've done professionally over the years. Talk to me a little bit about that notion of purpose and what it looks like from your point of view.
Maybe this is an older modernist idea that the work that we do as creative individuals has an impact on the society in which we live, that it's not neutral, and we're not just decorating the ground plane. We're actually doing work that transforms the physical space, and in my case, the installations that I do hopefully transform people's understanding of the society in which they live. They understand the histories of sight, which are often suppressed and complex. Again, this is why Walter's work appeals to me so much. The African American Museum and his landscape recalls the memory of enslavement, of the transit through the Gadsden Wharf, a site which was mute about its own history. And Walter brings that to the level of form. It demonstrates, it illustrates some aspects of this history which are not generally spoken about. Unfortunately, so much of this is now diminished as being woke, which seems a kind of misperception of a deeper understanding of history. This is all of our history. I was just up at Central Park. Susie Rodriguez, working with Chris Nolan and the Central Park Conservancy, has done a new pavilion, a skating pavilion, and a new pool and this ice skating rink up at the northern end at the Harlem Meer, sort of the last sector of the park, which is in itself interesting to get reformed. Without the both investment and the political will of the Central Park Conservancy, this project wouldn't have happened at the same quality. It is built beautifully. The craftsmanship is wonderful. And, people may say, well, did it need to be that fancy? And you think, well, this is public space. That should be the highest calling. This is something that was understood more fundamentally. And I think about Olmsted himself, that the purpose there was to make a green lung for the city and to allow the transportation, crosstown to happen. And it is just a miraculous projection of what the future history of the city is going to be, and the need for that kind of respite in the midst of the city. Can you imagine what New York would have been like with development from Fifth Avenue over to Central Park West being just densely built, how airless and dark that would have been. But part of the history of Central Park is also that there were communities that were displaced, a number of them African-American communities. Now, that doesn't diminish the greatness of Central Park, but I want to know that because it reflects our society at a point in time and also gives me a better understanding of the tensions that still exist, even between the southern end of the park and the northern end of the park. And it is a beautiful, beautiful project. The part that I found fascinating, and I found myself photographing a lot, there's a a bridge, a stone arch, which you find throughout the park. And this is the Huddlestone Arch that had been blocked up. And that's really what connected the southern end of the park with the northern end of the park. So by bringing back the pathways that Olmsted had originally crafted, which really connected every part of the park together, both for bicycles, vehicular traffic, and the pedestrian, these have now been opened up again. And I think we see Olmsted's attitude towards openness and interconnectivity as part of what contemporary landscape thought and planning has to do with. We think about Laurie Olin's project for the remaking of Bryant Park.
Walter, when you're leading people to this, hopefully, sense of choice, sense of freedom, maybe start with your studio, made reference to your studio and the way y'all work together. How do you think about leading your team in this respect?
That's a great question. How do I lead my team? We're still working through it. My team is at the scale that it is today is new. And we've talked a lot about it. One, as you might know, the whole apprenticeship or mentorship aspect of a collective culture has eroded, where now everyone has access to information. So it's as if, they already are there. And what we have to talk about is, collectively, how do we work together so that there's a learned experience. And I don't like the term leading, because that means, immediately when you said that's like the Pied Piper, I'm out in front. And I always try to, think about the collective always. I always like to talk about we. We are doing this, not I. That's one thing that's very important to me. The other is the hierarchy. In my studio, I sit down with everyone. I don't think there is I sit down with the lowest person, coming to entry level. I will sit down and make a model with them just as much as I will make a presentation with the principal. But I want them to kind of see that in the career, there's not always, you're not out there in front, right? You're part of the collective. And it's amazing some of the things I hear from them. It's like, wow, he did that in 5 minutes? Right? I mean, and they kind of marvel. They're like, he's sitting down with me. And I'm hoping that's something I can't tell them, but I'm hoping it rubs off. The other part of it is, I think being a good leader is to be a good listener. And this goes outside of the studio. I mean, when we work with communities, we don't like to, put things on the wall, tell me what you want, Post-its and things like that. We like to just listen. And it's amazing how much people want to say, right? And to allow them to say it. But on the other side, how do you listen, right? And you'd be surprised if once you become a good listener, what you hear. And it's not what people want most of the time. It's how they say it, how they feel it, and how they are attempting to articulate something that they don't know. Right? And particularly, when I'm talking about landscape architecture or architectural urbanism, they might not know what a bioswale is. They might, what these things are, but they're attempting to say something or allude to something that is already within our ability to take it somewhere. And I'm always surprised when they come back and they go, you listened to me. And it might not be the thing that they wanted, but it somehow encompasses, right, what they wanted. And they just didn't know what it was at the time. And that, to me, what good listening is about. And I'm hoping that even in my studio, I want to see people who rise up in my studio become, not me, I want them to become and find out that thing, right, that is in there that they haven't discovered yet. Because again, with this information, they They think design is the thing. It's on Pinterest. It's the precedent. And I keep saying, no, that's not it. Right? And again, how do you work through that?
A discovery.
Yeah.
Right? So it sounds almost as if the act of listening is one of being led, learning and being led yourself, right? So there's this simultaneous leading of people and being led.
Yes. And within that context, to allow people to see you becoming. I'm about to leave a job right now and take on another job, and everyone wants to call it retirement. Right? It's like, and I'm like, no, I'm just becoming.
We can't leave it there. What job are you leaving, and what job are you going to start?
I'm stepping down in my academic role, and I want to go back to the studio. I want to spend time more in my studio, not my office,
You mean
but
your art
my art studio. And I've laid a foundation that has allowed me to become, right? And being able to recognize that now's that time for that transition, where it's something that I've been becoming maybe for the last 20 years, but I feel now that even within my studio practice and everything else, that's the next part of becoming. And people in my studio, they've seen this, and I keep telling them, this is a career. And that yourself, if you're 20, by the time you're 40, you're going to be somewhere else. By the time you're 40, leave yourself that ability to be open to become.
Mark, what's the work that you're doing now and in the coming years?
Wow.
Tell me about that.
So it's interesting. I recently left my position at the American Academy in Rome, again, full circle, where Walter and I first met. And I guess I was attracted there by the possibility of taking this really miraculous institution that was about 120 years old, which supports American artists and scholars to live and work abroad, and bringing that again out to a larger public forum to make sure that the composition of fellows looked like America, to bring the complexity of ideas about thinking of contemporary society into very close contact with the work of people working in the humanities, people working in the arts. And I'm going back to an earlier time and actually going back to myself as a practitioner and thinking about the ways in which I can use this really kind of odd assembly of experiences and bring that back into site-specific public work. And I'm doing more photo-based work now, and it's actually linked to the kinds of projects that I worked on when I was at the Academy. Now that's 25, 30 years ago.
When you think about different modes of expression as a artist, as a landscape architect, as a teacher, the different hats you've worn, how do you think about those different modes of expression, be it creative expression or other sorts of expression?
It just so happens that, one takes the job, whether it's an academic, a principal of a design firm, whether it's architecture, landscape, or urbanism. Those are very particular practices that one engages in. On top of that, I make sure that there are these other things that I've always given these opportunities and this freedom that I discovered I needed to also do. That is writing. That is music. Used to be lots of other kinds of recreational activities, right? You gotta, whether it's I'm at home reading or I'm painting, I'm playing music, I'm doing something, but I gotta put in that time that when I go back to this other practice, it somehow takes me somewhere else. And I'm not in that same place that I left. So if I leave on Friday, I come back on Monday, I'm in a different place. It's one thing to work here on Friday, then go home, okay, weekend, do nothing, and I come back and pick up where I left off. Travel does this to me as well, right? My studio hates for me to travel.
Why?
When I come back, I'm changing everything. Particularly if I'm gone for a long time. Comes back and everything changes because, I've discovered these other things in the world that have had an impact on me that then, again, I'm not just picking the thing up that I left, but I'm allowing that to become because it's part of some larger thing.
Mark, so do you see yourself hatching new ideas over time and coming together with select collaborators to execute on projects? Or is it more you as an artist working in the studio, developing something in a solo fashion and then bringing it out into the world as a set of ideas?
It's probably both. It's probably making a place in which you're not thinking about the outside at all, right? I think the work that we do as creative individuals, it's not just illustrating. It's not just taking all of the facts and making a linear proposition that addresses all the facts that you find on site. There is this amazing thing that happens in the filter that we use as architects and artists. And there's a kind of oddly unconscious way of translating that information or recombining that information so that when it comes out as an expression, it somehow fits the bill of that specific site or the project that you're working on in ways that you might not have imagined. So you have to allow yourself that not knowing. This is often difficult at the juncture between public processes and the more personal work of an artist and an architect. And one's expectation shouldn't be that you're going to go out and talk about these great revelations that you had, which are important to you, but may not translate. You in some way have to make work that reads, across disciplinary sort of balkanized states.
I mean, I'm sure you'll be successful in doing that, and I look forward to following your journey. No, I really appreciate your openness and the way that you've effectively worked with other people and invited people into your world and encouraged them in their journey. And I think you have a lot more important work to do. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah.
This is very hopeful. I think my work was based, I do projects in Tokyo, I did projects in Germany and in Italy, and it's always about looking at the histories and the specifics of the culture and seeing the ways in which I can reposition that, project I did in Australia, which had to do with the deaths of two gay men that were actually murdered, it's assumed, by the police in the 60s. And those murders were actually the jumping off point for the first legislation that made it illegal to bother or molest people occupying public space, gay men, gay women. And so I wanted to call attention to that. The project I built was on the site of where this had taken place. And it reintroduced another generation to the kinds of things that had happened at that site and what kind of new social thought was created.
I think, one of the things I'd like the audience to understand is, if we're talking about environmental design per se, and how to live on this planet, there are different experiences that everyone has had in a place. And whether, you're built under a nationalistic structure, this idea of, I was going across the bridge today and I saw it again, e pluribus unum, out of many one. And in my mind, I immediately go, out of many, a diversity of one, right? I mean, that we have to get out of this idea that you go through the sieve and we all come out the same, which is a colonial and then has become a post-colonial idea that you and I, we have to believe the same things, do the same things in order to live together. And I think this is where design can help us understand that dialectic of time and meaning and memory, that, we can have been in the same event and remember it in multiple ways. And that's okay, right? Because that is the truth if we want to get to that, right? And it depends on your experiences and where you're coming from. And I think this accommodation, maybe not just accommodation, but the ability to see someone else's experiences. It's the old adage, walk in someone's shoes to understand them. Of course, we can't always do that. But that understanding of this person that I want to live with, they have something to offer me and I have something to offer them. And I wish more people were open with that. And lastly, I can design for any group of people on this planet. I feel like I can because I have those tools to do it. A lot of people feel they can't. And I would like for those people who feel that they can't stop thinking in that way. They should feel that they can. Because if you have empathy, if you have love, if you have an expectation of a collective future, then you can. But we've already kind of put this veil over a lot of people and said they have to live a certain way. They can't live like me. They have to live a certain way. And we're really bad at it in architecture, landscape architecture, because we put prefixes in front of everything. Once we say low-income housing, we know who that's for. But if you got rid of low income and just said housing, and you said, I'm doing housing for this group of people, you probably do it differently. And so that's what I would like to leave people with, because I think that's the only way we're going to live together in the future. If not, we'll live separately, right? And we know over time, from a sustainable point of view, that's not going to work. We can see that in history.
We've come full circle back to this notion of freedom. And I really like the way that you're encouraging an openness and a diversity of thinking, a diversity of experience, and a broad-ranging exposure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for all the work that you do. Really look forward to continuing to follow your work and seeing all the good things that you're doing.
Well, thank you. And hopefully things come to fruition. And, you never know where things might take us. Hopefully we get somewhere we've never expected to be, and it's a good thing.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it and look forward to talking again.
That was Walter Hood, a landscape architect, and Mark Robbins, an architect and leading voice in government, academia, and professional institutions. Walter is currently working on his next book, Hybrid Landscapes, which addresses how practical and speculative considerations in landscape design and art can coexist, and how ultimately they produce hybrid works. And Mark is currently working in his New York studio, creating art and what will ultimately become his next contribution to the public realm. Thanks so much for joining us. This episode was produced by the team at Radio Kismet, including Christopher Plant and Justin Berger. The production and editing staff also included Brick and Wonder team members Ed Thompson, Carrie Potter, Roya Osuli, and Amanda LaFontaine. I'm Drew Lang, and you've been listening to the Brick and Wonder podcast.